Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is Dr. Jenkins. Here we are for our final introductory chapter. So if you've been following along, so far we've done an intro chapter, then we did chemistry review, and then we did the cell, and now we have a chapter on tissues. This will be a relatively shorter chapter. And then after we finish this chapter, we will have completed all of the introductory stuff. And then from here on out, it's just going to be all body systems. We'll go body system by body system. And that's kind of cool. All right, so this chapter is on tissues. Just make sure you review what a body tissue is. I mean, keep it simple. A tissue is a group of similar cells, and the key there is similar. So if we look at muscle tissue, these pictures on your right are muscle tissue. It's basically just muscle cells joined together, and each individual muscle cell is similar. So cells that have a similar structure and function group together to form a tissue. All right, so it's just a group of cells, a grouping of cells with similar structure and function. Why do we care so much about this? Little Homer Simpson fun. We care about this because, folks, tissues make up everything. Everything in our body is tissue, is a group of cells. And what we're going to find out as we go through each body system is, muscle tissue is structured a certain way for a reason. Lung tissue looks like a certain way for a certain reason. So we're going to be literally talking about everything in our body, and the structure of the tissues is going to match the function. So there's a reason why we introduce these tissues, because they're all a little bit different, and ultimately how they are structured helps them do their specific function. These are some examples of how the structure matches the function. You do not have to know these. We will talk about these as we get to the body systems, but I do want to make some examples for you to understand why we're even having a chapter on this. This on the top right is the bladder. This is the bladder wall. If you notice, these top cells are kind of puffy. Well, that puffiness allows the bladder wall to expand, because when our bladder is full of urine, it expands. But that expansion is only possible because of this specialized stretchy tissue. If you look at the middle picture, this is the outer layer of our skin called the epidermis. Look how thick it is. Well, it makes sense. Wouldn't we want the outer surface of our skin that faces the external world? We want it to be thick for protection. On the other hand, the alveoli, or the layer of tissue that surrounds the very inside of our lungs, are very thin. And here, we don't need protection. We want the tissue to be thin to allow for gases to diffuse in and out of it. So you don't need to know these. I'm just giving you some examples. All right. So this chapter is pretty straightforward. When we talk about tissues in the body, there are 4 main types: connective, muscle, nervous, epithelial. These are our 4 main tissue types, and we're going to go through each one. I think we're going to cover a total of 20 tissues in total, and these will be split upon these same 4 main types or categories. All right, this is a general example of each function of these categories. We'll definitely get more specific when we get to it. When we think about epithelial tissue, something that is common to epithelial tissue is that it covers or surrounds things. The outer layer of our skin is epithelial tissue. The outer and inner layer of our organs are epithelial tissue. They cover things. As the name suggests, my friends, connective tissue binds things together, or dare I say, connects things. Muscle tissue is specially structured to allow for movement and contraction. And we probably are already aware that nervous tissue is specifically structured to allow for impulse conduction, which are nerve impulses. We're going to get more into these detailed examples, but I would like you to know these basic functions. Okay, let me just peek ahead because I want to make sure. Okay, thank you for playing along. There's a couple other characteristics that I wanted to point out. When we talk about epithelial tissue, remember, epithelial tissue covers things. It's the outer layer of our skin. It's the protective layer on the inside and outside of our organs. It covers body surfaces. What I want to point out is that if we have epithelial tissue, let's say that the red here is epithelial tissue. Well, always, and this isn't always the case, a lot of times in science, if you have a true-false exam question and it says always or never, that's almost always false. It's not very often that we can say always, but here we can. Epithelial tissue always has underneath it connective tissue. So these two exist together in the body. Always, always, always. Underneath epithelial tissue is connective tissue. And actually, that connective tissue is what supplies blood to the epithelial tissue, because the epithelial tissue itself is typically avascular. It does not have its own blood supply. But it's no biggie, because the underlying layer of connective tissue is able to supply the blood up to the epithelial tissue. Speaking of blood supply, when we talk about connective tissue, so we just finished saying that epithelial tissue is actually avascular, no blood supply, but it does get blood from the underneath connective tissue. Well, when we talk about connective tissue, the level of vascularity varies. Some connective tissues have a very good blood supply. For example, bone. What we're going to find out is bone is an example of connective tissue, and it has a very good blood supply, and as a result of that, it heals well. On the other hand, cartilage, this is an example of a type of connective tissue that has poor blood supply. I mean, it's got to have a little blood supply to be a living tissue, but it's much poorer of a blood supply. Therefore, cartilage, when injured, does not tend to heal as well because it doesn't have as much blood supply rushing through it. So you should know those things that we just pointed out. All right, so here are the tissues I'm going to ask you to know. It's a little bit less than 20. So we have 3 types of epithelial, 3 types of muscle, 1 type of nervous tissue, and 5 connective. 5, 8, 11. So you have 12 total. Look at me being nice here. For my higher level classes, I usually ask them to know 20 types, but I think 12 will be good. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Here we go. For each... Sometimes I'm so funny, it's not even funny, so you can just ignore this one. What you need to know for each of those 12 tissue types, location and function. So for each of those 12 tissue types, be able to give me 1 place in the body where it's found, location, and be able to give us 1 function. All right. Okay, we are going to start with epithelial tissue. We already know epithelial tissue covers things. We already know that epithelial tissue itself is avascular, but it gets blood supply from the connective tissue underneath it. When we look at the names of epithelial tissue, it's actually kind of simple and it makes sense, which is wonderfully refreshing to see. Anytime we have a simple epithelial tissue, it is only one layer. When we have a stratified epithelial tissue, it is 2+ layers. So we name an epithelial tissue based off of how many layers it has, simple or stratified. And then we finish naming our epithelial tissue by the shape of the cells that make it up. Are the shapes flat, squamous? Are these cells cube-shaped, cuboidal? Or are their cells columnar or column-shaped? You are being asked to know 2 different types, simple squamous. Let me go back to my list here to make sure. You're being asked to know 3 types. Okay. One of them is simple. That means it has one layer in thickness. One of them is stratified, which means it has 2 or more layers. And they are both squamous, which tells us the cells are flat in shape. I'm going to talk about what pseudostratified means. You don't need to know that now, but you can see that type of tissue has column-shaped cells. Good. Simple squamous. I would like you to know this one. This is a 1-layer tissue, simple, of flat-shaped cells, squamous. Where do we find it? In the inner lining of the lungs. Because it's only 1 layer thick, things can diffuse through it. So we diffuse gases into and out of the lungs. Diffusion of gases. Cool. Epithelial, simple squamous, 1 layer thick, flat-shaped cells. We find it in the lungs. The function is to allow for diffusion of gases. I'd also like you to know stratified squamous. Same idea, flat-shaped cells, but instead of being simple, which is only 1 layer, it is stratified, many, many layers. Technically, this whole thickness is stratified squamous. Many, many layers of flat-shaped cells. Where do we find it? Outer layer of the skin. You can't just say skin because other portions of our skin have other tissue types, particularly connective tissue, but it is the outermost layer or epidermis. And because it's stratified, many, many layers, its function is protection. There are other places where you will find this. So you can see in these pictures, it lists other places: nose, mouth, esophagus, the vaginal canal. I'm only picking out one. Let me see here. So you can see the area that I'm picking out is the epidermis or outer layer of the skin. Same thing here. We can look at other places, but I'm only asking you to know one place, and that's the lungs. So, stratified squamous, many, many layers of flat-shaped cells found in the outer layer of the skin called the epidermis, functions in protection. Excuse me. The last type I'd like you to know for epithelial tissue is pseudostratified columnar. And this is a little bit tricky. Pseudostratified. Stratified means many layers, right? In this case, it is only pseudostratified, which means that it looks like it has multiple layers, but in actuality, it only contains one. All right, so a pseudostratified looks like it has many layers, when in actuality, it only has one. If I look down here, it might look like many layers. It might look like a layer here and a layer here. But it's actually one layer of the column-shaped cells. If I look at the top picture, it might look like this is a layer and this is a layer, but it's actually one layer. The reason why it may look like it has multiple layers is because some of the nuclei of the cells are higher, some of the nuclei of the cells are lower. So because the nuclei, some are high, some are low, because of that, it may give the illusion that it has multiple layers, but it really doesn't. Something else that is unique about the pseudostratified columnar is that it contains cilia. We find this in the trachea, lines the inside of the trachea, and one of its functions is to filter incoming air. Those little cilia or hairs help to catch or trap incoming bacteria or debris. Trachea filters out debris. There are other types of epithelial tissue, but those are the only three you had to know. Simple squamous, stratified squamous, pseudostratified columnar. Okay, now we're moving into the connective tissue. This is a category of tissues that functions usually to bind things together or connect. This category of tissue contains a really wide array. So because of that, we can't have a system that's so easy to name them as it was with the epithelium. So we're going to start with the adipose connective tissue. This is what fat is, ladies and gentlemen. This is our fat tissue. It looks like little marshmallows or bubbles. Kind of looks like fat, doesn't it? Yeah. We find this under the skin in the dermis layer. If you recall, the stratified squamous epithelial tissue was found in the epidermis or outermost layer. Here we have the adipose that is found in the dermis. You may even call it hypodermis, but deeper layers of the skin. Functions of adipose: protection, it's cushiony protection, and we know that triglycerides or fat can be metabolized for energy. So when we see the fat in here, it is just stored energy. Okay. That was one type of tissue called adipose. Now we have another type of tissue that's connective tissue called dense regular. Taking a drink, I'm sorry. Dense regular. Okay. Dense regular has thick bands. And these happen to be thick bands of collagen. What makes this classified as regular, quote unquote, is that these thick bands are parallel to each other. Even though overall the collagen fibers aren't straight across, they're not directly horizontal, they're considered in a regular pattern because they're parallel. We find dense regular connective tissue in our tendons and ligaments. Obviously, this is a strong type of connective tissue, either connects bone to bone or muscle to bone. It is able to withstand stress. More particularly, dense regular connective tissue really functions to withstand stress in one direction. Looking at this picture on the right, if I put a force here and I pull on this tissue this way, and I pull on the tissue this way, these fibers that were wavy would now become taut or tight, and that's how they can withstand stress. We want the area right here where a muscle connects to a bone. You want it to be really strong in this direction. This is different, for example, even though we're not covering it, there is another type of connective tissue that is called dense irregular, that is found in our joint capsules, that is found underneath our skin. Dense irregular connective tissue is structured so that it can withstand stress from multiple directions. And that would be not as strong overall as this dense regular. Because all the fibers are in one direction parallel to each other, it can really help us withstand force in that one direction. And we find these in tendons and ligaments. Make sure you review the definition of both of those. A tendon connects a muscle to a bone. A ligament connects a bone to a bone. All right. So as you can see already, connective tissue is kind of all over the place. Well, another example of connective tissue is cartilage. We have 3 different types of cartilage in the body. We first have elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage, if you look at this picture, if you look carefully, you'll see little almost spiderweb looking fibers. Those are elastic fibers. So this type of cartilage is not overall very strong, but it has elasticity. So if I stretch it and then I let go, it will recoil back to its original position. We find it in the outer ear. And really, this is not about strength so much as it just is about giving shape. Your outer ear doesn't need to be very strong. That elastic cartilage is there just to maintain a shape, to help us bring sound waves into our ear canal. On the other hand, we have hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage may look similar, but it doesn't have the fibers going through. Instead, it's a smooth background. I'm not going to ask you to identify these on a picture. I'm just giving you some details. One place where we find hyaline cartilage is that it connects the rib cage to the sternum. So these areas that are kind of orange in color, these are hyaline cartilage. It connects the rib cage to the sternum. It does give some strength, but also some flexibility. We find hyaline cartilage a bunch of other places. I just picked one here that you have to know. And then thirdly, we have our fibrocartilage. This is found in our intervertebral discs, and it's the strongest of all the cartilages. All right, so make sure you review those. You could imagine some matching on our quiz or midterm exam where I give you a tissue type and then you match it up with its function and or location. Connective tissue also includes bone. If you look at bone under a microscope, it kind of looks like a tree trunk cross section. You have these concentric circles. Each circle is an example of bone tissue. We know what bone tissue does, gives us support, holds our body up. Lastly, you may not think of blood as a tissue. Oh, but it sure is. Isn't tissue a collection of cells with a similar structure and function? We got blood cells that hang out together. So even if all the parts of the tissue aren't necessarily touching, we still have it in our body. And it is still an example of connective tissue. So blood, collection of blood cells. These circles somehow got off center, and I apologize. We find them in the blood vessels. And one function of the, for example, red blood cells is they transport oxygen. Okay, so we've done epithelial tissue. We've done connective tissue. Let's move on to muscle tissue. There's 3 types: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. I'd like you to know all 3. Muscle tissue looks very unique, particularly skeletal muscle, it's very dense, right? Very dense. It has a lot to do. But if I were to be asking you to identify these by picture, which I'm not, but if I was, you should be able to identify the muscle right away. Okay, skeletal muscle. When you look at skeletal muscle has these vertical striations, meaning if I look at this, it has some lines that go up and down. These are the muscles that attach to bone. These are the muscles that you think about, your biceps brachii, your hamstrings, etc. But what unites them as one is that they all attach to a bone. These are contracted voluntarily. These are the muscles of our limbs. These are our voluntarily controlled muscles. We also have smooth muscle. Smooth muscle does not have any vertical lines, does it? No, it does not. Muscle tissue like this, smooth muscle, is found lining the walls of the GI tract. Your esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, anus, all of these organs have unique walls. And one of the inner things that we talk about is that they, just lost my train of thought there. I'm so sorry. Okay, let's try that again. Our GI organs have these walls. The inner lining of the GI organs have smooth muscle. Particularly, it helps to move things through the GI tract. Think about peristalsis. It's only possible because we have the smooth muscle lining the inside of the smooth muscle tissue. Lastly, we have cardiac muscle. Before I go do that, this is also involuntarily controlled. You don't have to think about these to contract them. Your body does it for you. What we're going to find is the only type of muscle tissue that is voluntarily controlled is skeletal. Smooth muscle is involuntarily controlled. Cardiac muscle is also involuntarily controlled. This is the muscle that makes up the walls of the heart. So your heart is really a big fat muscle with some space in the middle. Something that is unique about cardiac muscle, it does have some really thin striations, like skeletal muscle, but something that's unique about cardiac compared to skeletal muscle is every so often you see a darker band. You don't have to know these for the exam, but if I compare those darker bands every once in a while, to skeletal muscle looks the same throughout. Cardiac muscle is a little bit more specialized, and every so often is a darker band. That happens to be called an intercalated discs. You don't need to know them. That is something that you could help tell the difference between skeletal and cardiac. But more importantly, cardiac muscle tissue is how the heart contracts, made up of involuntarily controlled cardiac muscle tissue. Lastly, we have nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is unique in its structure. It kind of has a kite shape to it, and then one long tail. We'll have a whole chapter on this later. Where do we find nervous tissue? Brain, spinal cord. The function of this tissue is to send nerve impulses. One thing that's also unique is that we are not able to regenerate the central nervous system. If we have a peripheral nerve on our fingertip and we cut it, we're probably going to be able to regenerate that part of the nerve, but particularly in the brain and spinal cord, it cannot be regenerated. All right. Quick one there. List the tissues, give a structure and function, and then I'll see you for the next chapter, which is our first body system.